So I guess I will just, poach directly from Eric's book, Going Solo, which is that in 1950, 22% of American adults were single people. And today, for the first time in centuries, and again, I'm completely plagiarizing from Eric's book, the majority of American adults are single. So this is a New York story, but it's not just a New York story. And so in your book, you really kind of, again, sort of open people's eyes, I think, to a segment of the population that perhaps is invisible or not recognized as a class. And one of the things you say in your book is you identify a group called singletons instead of singles. And I wanted to just start by asking you sort of what that phrase meant and why you made that differentiation.
This book, Going Solo, actually did grow directly out of the book I wrote about Heatwave, which is my native city. I grew up in Chicago. And that was a story about hundreds of people who died alone during a very short 3-day heatwave in 1995. And the book was about how that could happen, and also how an event like that could happen and fail to generate the kind of attention that you might expect for a major urban disaster in the United States in the 1990s. When the book was finished, I had this nagging feeling like I had touched on this issue of what it means to have cities where so many people are living alone and aging alone and dying alone, but I hadn't really handled it adequately, and I knew that I wanted to go back and study it more. So I developed a relationship with the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, which does a lot of work on health, and they wanted me to write about the rise of social isolation in cities. And I pitched a project to them that was called Alone in America. And for many years, thought that I was going to be writing a book called Alone in America, which is a really sad thing, right? If you think about the concept of Alone in America, you'll notice that that's a really different idea than Going Solo, right? So hopefully one of the things we'll talk about tonight is how you get from the Chicago heat wave and hundreds of people dying alone in stifling apartments to Alone in America to Going Solo. But what happened is that when I kind of pulled out of the Chicago story, I was expecting to find a topic that was basically the Chicago story writ large. The people who were living alone, I thought, would be people who were older, who were more frail, who lived in poor neighborhoods, who were really vulnerable, and for sure that part of the population is out there and deserves far more attention than we give it. But I also have these striking things. The numbers you gave, it's about half of American adults are single, by which I mean just unmarried. And about 33 million Americans are what I call singletons, to answer your question. And singletons are people who are single and also live alone. So only about a third of people who are single live alone. Singletons are specific. And it's a national story for sure, the numbers you gave, from 22% single to 49% single. It's from about 9% of all households as one-person households in 1950 to 28% of all households in the United States are one-person households today. That's at the national level. But of course, really, it's an urban story. In Manhattan, where we are tonight, nearly 1 of every 2 households are one-person households. And cities that have 40% or more of their households as one-person households include Washington, D.C., and Denver, and Seattle, and Atlanta. Lots of cities are above a third. So this is really an urban transformation. And the thing that was really striking for me is if you look at the historical record or the anthropological record, you notice that really in the history of our species, you cannot find a single society that has sustained large numbers of people living alone for long periods of time. It simply has never been done. And it starts to happen here in the United States around the 1950s. And I came to believe that we are in the midst of this incredible social experiment, the results of which are really unclear to us still. And it's clearly not the story that I thought it was going to be. It's not the sad story of Alone in America, though it does have sad features, which I'm sure we'll touch on. It's really something more profound. And what's strange about the fact that it's invisible as a public issue, or at least has been until I think pretty recently, is that probably every one of us can make a direct connection to it. Either we live alone or someone in our family or friendship network lives alone, and we think about them and how they're living and what it means that they live alone all the time. So it's one of these things that's like an open secret, and it seems to me like it's time to talk about it.
Yeah, and I think, you know, when you talk about the numbers in New York, the numbers of households, I mean, one of the things that is sort of core to our work is to get people to understand what it means when we talk about housing in particular, and we use the word household. Because what those numbers really mean in New York is that a third of the housing units across the city of New York are occupied by one person alone. And while, yes, there's some number of them who just, you know, are lying about their secret roommate or live-in partner when the census takers come, that's how our housing units are being occupied. And in Manhattan, it's half the housing units. So when we started to look at this from a completely sort of different perspective than you looked at it from the people side, we started looking at it from the housing side. Who is really behind that door? And normal housing analysis just doesn't tell that story. You know, it talks about average household size and stuff that just truly makes no sense if you want to understand who's really behind that door. And what we saw was so many households in New York City have at least one additional adult over the age of 25. And only 17% of our housing units are actually occupied only by what you think of as a traditional nuclear family. So single people were not just living alone, they were sort of embedded in these other households. And we saw this sort of major transformation from a physical point of view. What does this mean for the housing stock?
I mean, clearly whether what you're concerned about is our cultural expectations about what a family should look like or how a life should be lived, or whether we're talking about what a city should look like and how a city's housing stock should be organized, our expectations are really out of whack with the reality of how we live. And the conversations we have about who we are and how we live and how our cities work is really out of touch with the things that people are really doing with themselves. Now, let me just, so one of the sections in the book, towards the end of the book, I talk about the possibility of retrofitting cities. You know, what would it look like if we retrofit cities to deal with the population that we have? I think generally we have a response to hearing about, there's two kinds of responses that I hear a lot when I put out the numbers of how many people are living alone. One of them you kind of went to for a second, and I didn't know where you were going to go, which was to say, well, we all know that people don't tell the truth to the census, and you know, it's New York, so everybody's kind of got a deal going. And you say to somebody, there's only one person, but actually, you know, there's 16 families in the apartment, or something like that. But and so when I started giving talks about this, people would say, well, but you're in New York, and you know, who can trust those New Yorkers? But look, remember that this phenomenon is completely widespread. This is not a New York story. This is not about lying to your landlord to, you know, you find this in every city. And we'll talk about how expansive it is. I mean, I will just give it away right now. I told you that the tentative title for the book and the working idea for the project was Alone in America. And I learned over the course of the research that I was completely wrong about how alone people are when they're going solo. It turns out that people who live alone are actually more likely than married people to spend time with friends and neighbors, and even more likely than married people to volunteer in civic organizations, which I really didn't expect. The idea of like the selfish single narcissist, it just doesn't hold water. But the other thing is that this in America idea was completely silly. I really thought this was about, you know, the United States and our excessive individualism, and this is about, you know, Thoreau and Emerson and the Lone Ranger, and you know, this whole idea that we are extreme individualists. Like the best-selling books in sociology have titles like The Fall of Public Man, and maybe you recognize these books, you know, The Lonely Crowd, Bowling Alone. It's like we love to come together in big groups and talk about how alone we are. It's a great way to spend the evening. You know, but actually this has nothing to do with the United States. We are laggards when it comes to living alone. It's far more common in Europe than it is in the US. It's more common in Japan than the US. It's more common in Canada than the US. The places on earth that have the highest rates of living alone are Scandinavian countries, which are known for their communalism and socialism. So this is not a statistical artifact. This is not about lying to the census. Then the other thing I think that people oftentimes react to this is like, oh well, clearly this is not the kind of thing that we want to change cities to deal with. But this is a bad thing. We should be really, really deeply worried about the fact that people live this way, and that half of adults are single right now, and that so many people are living alone, because clearly living alone means being lonely or being isolated. And maybe I've had arguments with people who say, we're actually lonelier than we've ever been. This is the loneliest moment in American history, for which there's not a shred of evidence. And I think it's a mistake to treat the issue this way as well. There's this story that we like to tell about ourselves, that once upon a time we lived in a golden age. The kind of families stayed together, children were happier, no one got divorced, no one felt lonely, people played in the streets. That idea. And we talk as if history since that moment, and it's usually like the 1950s, has been nothing but a total collapse.
Or if there even was ever that moment.
Well, so that's the thing. I mean, I guess what I've come to realize is that I trust the sociology of Mad Men much more than the sociology of Father Knows Best.
Right.
Because in fact, I think that world that we idealize was full of a lot of loneliness and a lot of alienation and a lot of dysfunction and a lot of repression of women, for sure, that we don't quite own up to. And so maybe for some people things are worse now than they were 50 or 60 years ago, but there's lots of reasons that things are tough right now. And I'm just very skeptical about the idea that we should look at these changes as a sign of decline. It seems to me like these are changes, and they're profound changes, but we still don't quite know what they mean. And the book is really an attempt to think that out.
And hopefully the changes are really about putting more choice on the table for people. I mean, again, one of the things I remember from going solo when you talked about Scandinavia, and there was some guy in the book, I guess, that you interviewed, and the question was like, well, why do so many of you live alone? And he said, because we can afford to.
No, he just said because we can't.
We can't,
yeah.
Right? But it's like it was an affirmative choice. It wasn't this sad, lonely person alone with a bottle of pills and an old newspaper.
So this is a really
it's a choice that provides for a lot of people freedom and self-expression, and this is particularly. Partly I think in our society we've got this kind of love-hate thing with the single person's life, and maybe it's because we've idealized it in all kinds of both the guy on the stoop with the Thunderbird and brown paper bag, and then Sex in the City, or something. These huge extremes of our vision, and we're not quite sure how we see ourselves.
Yeah,
but the reality is people are living very fulfilled lives as well, and participating in the society.
Yeah, so I have a hard time with this part of the conversation, because the truth is I'm interested in getting rid of the idealizations on both sides. Right. I think we need to be realistic about this, and we need to understand that in fact people do choose to live alone, and that there are many reasons that people enjoy living alone, and we need to recognize and I think respect that. For that reason, many of the reviewers who've written about the book consider it, optimistic, effusive, surprisingly positive, etc. On the other hand, there are people who read the book and think, like, God, a lot of the people you profile here are really struggling because there is no perfect way to live, and you would be a fool to think that to live alone is not to confront all sorts of serious challenges, including the problem of dealing with the feeling of loneliness, or the feeling that you're not living the way you're supposed to be living, and maybe you would be happier. Of course, everyone does that. People who are married do that as well. But I think that sometimes we compare living alone with an ideal marriage, which is really hard to get. And we compare the ideal marriage, we compare a bad marriage with like the ideal of living alone, like everybody is out in the Sex and the City set, which is a really hard set to get on, it turns out. So clearly people are opting into this, and that's important. And I have this provocative thing that I've said, and we'll repeat here tonight, and people always want to ask me, well, how much of this living alone is really by choice, and how much is people have to do it? And my response to that is 100% of people who live alone are living alone by choice, or something pretty close to it. This is kind of an outrageous thing to say, I recognize. But by that I mean that people who are single, whether they've never been married or never had a domestic partner, or whether they're divorced or whether they are bereaved, widows and widowers, even when they're very old, actually do have other ways that they could live. And in fact, 60, 70 years ago, if you were an older person and you lost your husband or wife, you would most certainly move in with family members. It would be very unusual for you to live alone. Same is true for women, actually, who got divorced. They were very likely, in the rare event that they got divorced, to move back in with family members. Living alone is expensive. You have to pay a premium to get a place of your own. And even today, people have other options. There are other ways to live. There are possible ways to get roommates, to live in an institutional environment, to live with family members or friends. So we might not want to do those things. We might say to ourselves today, well, that's clearly undesirable. But we have to recognize the demand for this. And for me, talking here, we did more than 150 interviews with older people living alone. And one of the really interesting things I learned from those conversations was that living alone for older people in the United States is not just a choice. Most people we interviewed said that their sense of dignity and integrity rested on their capacity to maintain a place of their own. That if they ever found themselves in a situation when they couldn't live alone and they had to move into some other situation, they would feel that as a loss of face. That would be a sign that something really bad was about to happen. And it's the last thing they wanted. So this is not to say that most people who live alone think it's the best way to live, or that it's their goal to live that way. I did not discover that. People have mixed feelings about it, but they all felt like, given the choices, it was the best way to live at the moment.
Yeah, and I think, again, sort of the different housing prototypes reflect this sort of hidden demand, let's say, for single people. And one of the things we found when we were looking at best practices for single people in housing in different cities around the world, and one of the projects that actually didn't make it into the exhibition was a project in Vienna, very near to the downtown, that a developer did with a very interesting perspective. He did a building of small units, furnished, was renting them for 6 months. You could do two renewals, so you could have it for 18 months, but no more. And quite close to downtown and quite affordable. His target audience for that housing was graduate students who were in Vienna who didn't want to live in a dorm or at the university, and also contract workers who were sent there for their company to work in Vienna for a year or something. And while he got those people, the majority of people in his building ended up being middle-aged people who had been divorced and had lived in the suburbs, raised their children in the suburbs, got divorced in their 50s, and sort of woke up and said, why am I living here? I don't really know where I want to live. I want to try on a different hat. I'm not sure what the next stage of my life is going to be. And they would move into this building. And so he ended up with this building with this sort of, really interesting combination of international workers, graduate students from Turkey, and middle-aged women from the suburbs.
It's just completely set up. I mean, I think that's really interesting. And the truth is that it's not that people are living alone for their whole lives or making a commitment to one thing or the other. What's really distinctive about the time we live in is that people are moving in and out of these different situations. There's a lot of fluidity. And I think some cities and some nations are thinking about how to plan housing for that and how to build cities for that, much more consciously than we are here in New York or in the United States. So this is tricky for me. The last chapter of the book is really about redesigning solo living, and I write about this housing complex in Stockholm. So in Sweden, about 47% of households are one-person households at the national level, and in Stockholm it's about 60%. And so, as a sociologist, one of my pet peeves is reading a book, the conclusion of which is, look at how they do it in Scandinavia. You know, it's much better in Scandinavia.
Right, it's very helpful. Right.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'll just put that right through Congress next week. So, of course, my book ends in Scandinavia. But, you know, I couldn't not write about it because, I mean, it really is the place where they're thinking about this. And so I wrote about this place called Farknappen. And it's so interesting to me, and if you speak Swedish, forgive that, whatever word I just said. It's a place that recognizes that there is actually a lot of demand for relatively small residential units that have kitchens and, you know, that are self-contained. Hopefully you went upstairs to the making room exhibit before tonight's conversation. If you didn't, I hope you go back and look at the micro unit there, because I've seen it in different micro units now, and every time someone walks into one that's well designed, they have exactly the same response, which is like, oh my God, wow, I can't believe this. It's really not what they expected. So the places in Stockholm in this complex, they're a little bigger than that, but nicely designed. And what's amazing is the social organization of the place has a very large common space at the first level, a large, beautiful kitchen with big windows, a very large dining room, and everyone who lives in the building has to commit to helping to cook 3 nights a month. And then every morning when you leave, you sign up to say whether or not you want to have dinner there that night. It's an option. And if you want to have a guest, you know, for which you pay some modest fee. And it means that everyone who lives in the building has a way to go to work or do whatever they want to do, and also have a meal waiting for them. And then of course they have a beautiful library, a movie room, an exercise room, a garden in the back. It's got all these things. And one thing that's really interesting about it is, in order to live there, you have to be 45 or above, which is not, you probably thought about this already, 65 or above, which makes a big difference, right? It's not a geriatric ghetto. It's not a place where, you know, you can only live if you're older and you know what the story of the next 20 years of your life is going to be. It's really a place that has this age diversity that makes it interesting. And the younger people have had all sorts of changes in their lives, and they like the security of having a place there. You can live in a couple there, it's not like you have to be single. And the older people like the dynamism of it. And it was so interesting to see a model like that, and to think about all the planning and thought that went into figuring out how to provide for people the kind of privacy and autonomy that they want from their own individual unit, but also the shared spaces that they want to be in an active social life. And I realized that at the time, the only people who were really getting that kind of thought and attention in places like New York City were like these really affluent young professionals for whom there's a whole new set of options, because, you know, companies like The Related. I wrote a piece for Fortune magazine called The Solo Economy about all the ways in which this demographic transformation has affected business, including the real estate business. And there's huge demand, as we all know from looking at the rents, for smaller urban apartments. And a lot of young professionals are interested in, they will pay a lot of money for a relatively small space in the right neighborhood if there are terrific high-end amenities. Like so like The Related owns Equinox. I didn't realize that until I wrote the story. And they have these buildings where they have these amazing gyms and great coffee bars and internet bars and party rooms and movie theaters, and they do all these things there for residents. And I think that it's great that young affluent people have that option. I would love us to start thinking about how we could democratize access to those kinds of places. You know, maybe it would be a YMCA, not an Equinox. Maybe they would serve like less than Starbucks coffee in the coffee shop. But as this country gets older and the boomers start to live alone, those numbers will go up as the population of people living alone grows. We will have major housing challenges to deal with. And one thing I love about the work that you've been doing, and that this exhibit is pushing New Yorkers to do, is that it helps us start that conversation.
And I think, one of the things that is really striking, particularly about your Scandinavian example, is these are buildings that are really about building a community. within a building structure. And I think, you'll see if you looked at the monitor upstairs where the ADAPT RFP respondents were, and it's a little hard, you can't get the whole story because you're looking at architectural drawings, but all of those proposals had something interesting in common, which wasn't how well they designed the small spaces, but they all provided fairly substantial kind of public shared spaces to create that sense of community. And I think this is something that's really missing from housing design in general, and thinking about housing policy in general. And I will also add that while the very wealthy single people can access small units, so can the extreme homeless, mentally ill, right, people with special needs, through the supportive housing program. And this is one of the great ironies, that just somebody who's just out of graduate school and got a job, for example, with my daughter, which became a librarian at Sarah Lawrence, and makes a modest, she thinks opulent, but she's still living at home, salary.
She's also the only recent graduate with a job, period.
She is. Believe me, we're delighted. Yeah. So, but there aren't these options in that middle range. And one of the things that I love about the book, and I hope that people will connect with the exhibition, is that in New York, there was a time when we had a great variety of housing for single people. Because actually New York has always had a big percentage of single people, right? We're the big city, you come to...
Starting in the 20th century.
Right, you come to make your fortune, and we just had this amazing array of housing. Now, some of it was terrible, the SRO stock, which deteriorated in the 70s and 80s, but for many decades, the SRO stock was a great place for people to start out. Yeah. There were lodging houses, there were boarding houses, there were women-only hotels, there were something we discovered in a building with a certificate of occupancy that called for bachelor apartments. I thought, what's that? And it was this idea, you took these brownstones, and so the landlady would, you'd have your room, and maybe she'd wash your sheets and towels for you, and maybe you'd come down and have a meal with her. It wasn't quite a boarding house. And it was literally, the certificate of occupancy actually said bachelor apartment, So there was this great variety, which when the rise of sort of the idealized nuclear family happens in the 50s, there's also in New York this complete eradication that begins, this sort of attack on housing for single people. And I feel like it was a kind of almost a demonization of single people that maybe happens at the same time. I wonder, when you were saying the kind of responses you get to the book, that you were surprised that when you say to people that single people, in fact, are very engaged in civic life and volunteering. These are really important things for people to start to understand, that single people are, useful additions to your community.
Well, I think that's right. There remains some stigma around living alone and being single. We are very far from where we were, 50, 60 years ago. For instance, in 1957, a group of psychologists from the University of Michigan surveyed Americans about their attitudes towards single and married people, and they reported that 80% of American adults thought that women who were single and were happy to remain single were either sick, neurotic, or immoral. So we've come a long way. But not all, we haven't come all the way, right? So there's no single person, there's no single woman in her 30s who could not tell the story of going to a family dinner for Thanksgiving or, some other holiday and having at least one and maybe many relatives immediately, hit her with all kinds of questions about her dating life and whether she's met the right person and what's wrong with her. In fact, most single people generally will tell you that they have certain friends who immediately see them and start talking about their dating life and can I fix you up with someone? And there's a concept, the concept of stigma in sociology actually means spoiling your identity, but which is to say, when you're stigmatized, people see you only through that identity construct. So if you're African American, that becomes your identity. That if you're gay, that becomes your identity. It's like there's nothing else. And single is really like that for a number of people.
And it trumps all other things.
And it trumps all other things, except that, I think what single people start to perceive is that people are really projecting their own anxieties onto them. It's really about the person, because we don't all respond that way. And so one nice thing about that's happened since the book came out a year ago, and actually this, maybe not that you don't know this, but tonight is the kind of paperback launch of Going Solo. So you're here for history, folks. So since the book has come out, I've gotten all of these really interesting emails and comments at reading things of people saying, look, my son or daughter is 28 or 31 and single, or 39 or 41 and single, and I've been so anxious about it and so upset, and I've now, with understanding the story here and the trend, really makes me recognize that this is not this weird, one-off thing. And also, messages from people who are themselves in their 50s or 60s saying, look, it's really nice to know that I'm not alone, and to feel like someone is telling us, recognizing this part of the American experience as well. I think what we failed to appreciate, and I write about this, in the book a little bit, is the contributions that single people make, not just to civic life, but also to our economy. Because you will be shocked to learn that people who live alone and are single are more likely to go out at night and spend time and money in bars and cafes and restaurants than people who are married. Let me tell you, so I am myself married. I have 2 young children. And I could rightly be accused of fantasizing a little bit about all those lucky people who get to be out in the streets of Manhattan, at night doing. So they are pumping a lot of money into the economy. They have more discretionary, they do more discretionary spending on average than people who are married and have children. And so if you think about what the economy, as bad as it is, would look like without single people spending in the way that they do, it's really something. And so, look, one thing we know now is that the real estate developers are starting to wake up to this phenomenon. People who do all kinds of consumer businesses are starting to wake up to it. Like, have you noticed, if you go to Whole Foods or some grocery store, the salad bars and the ready-made places that you can get hot food to bring home a single serving of, or the single serving items that you can now find for a number of different things that, it's not just like a Costco, massive thing, like the smaller ice cream containers and things like that. That is a consequence of retailers recognizing that there are people who live alone. All this personal and home services, dry cleaning and home cleaners. There are all kinds of things that you're seeing in the economy right now that are about kind of chasing singles. And of course, like, the 2 people who chased singles more than anyone else in 2012 were Barack Obama and Mitt Romney. The political officials political parties have recognized that, single voters are a very big and significant bloc. And of course, we heard a lot about single voters during 2012. So it feels as if the world is beginning to wake up to this phenomenon, and I think that's long overdue.
Now, how much do you think the rise of sort of the single person living is connected to the rise of sort of the digital world and the world of the internet? And are these things symbiotic? Do they influence each other somehow? Or?
So I'm glad you asked that, and there's a section in the book where I kind of write about the different drivers, like what are the things that have really produced this change? Why are so many people living alone today? And definitely one of them is the communications revolution, right? Because if you're home and alone, and there's no communications media there, that could be a really lonely and alienating experience. If you're sitting home alone and you've got a telephone or television, you're now connected to the world in kind of a different way. You can be entertained, you can have a little communication. If you're home and alone and you have the internet and you have Facebook and Skype and instant messaging and email and all of the things that we have in our world today, you can actually be involved in something that's like a social experience. Now, that doesn't mean that it's the same as being face-to-face, but one of the really surprising things I learned looking at the research while I was writing the book is that people who are the heaviest users of social media are actually also the heaviest users of FaceTime, face-to-face interaction. I say that because actually there's like an Apple application called FaceTime, and I don't mean that. Like, if people who are heavy users of social media actually really like social life, and people use that technology in their homes to make plans to meet up with other people. By the way, that is increasingly true for older people. I can't see you, so I don't know if any of you are older or have grandchildren, but there are a lot of people, older people who are part of meetup groups and are meeting other older people for social occasions, and who are also having these neat interactions with their family members, which translate into really interesting relationships through computers. So I know that we live in a moment where we're really anxious about the fact that we like to go to bed and cuddle up with our iPads instead of our spouses. And I am also concerned about my children who see me with my machines, and then they want to be with their machines, and I certainly don't like it when my taxi driver is barreling down Fifth Avenue texting and watching something on his phone. But I think that we've grown a little overly anxious about this. We fail to recognize the ways in which social media really are connecting us and help to connect people who live alone. The other thing I'd say that really is important here is the rising status of women. You really can't understand the rise of living alone outside of women's entry into the labor force en masse, their cultural and personal independence, the sexual revolution, birth control pill. When these things happen, and when women get really good, much better access into the paid labor market than they had before, this really changes everything. And you can't find a place on earth today where there's a lot of affluence and the cultural and personal freedom of women where you don't have high levels of living alone. So it's not just about affluence, because, for instance, in Saudi Arabia, there's incredible affluence and basically no one lives alone. And that's about the treatment of the world.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's like a really good point, because again, if we're trying to dispel that sort of lonely spinster life, right, which is, again, part of the messages of the 1950s. And you contrast that with, Virginia Woolf and her ideas in A Room of One's Own, where it was absolutely core. She's arguing in that essay, it's absolutely core for a woman to have an intellectual life. She's got to have her own space. Right.
Well, for me, the change, the major ideological change you see in Helen Gurley Brown's amazing book from 1962, Sex and the Single Girl, where she goes on and on about how important it is to have your own place. She's an amazing writer, and she has this line which is something like, "You need to get your own apartment, even if it's over your garage." I don't mean not a sorority house kind of situation. You really need to have the experience of living alone in order to grow up. And I do think that now that the age of first marriage is higher than it's ever been in the United States and in many similar countries, a growing proportion of young people see getting their own apartment as the way to grow up. The way you become an adult for a big part of kind of this demographic is to get your own place, and it's a very important experience. And so it's interesting. I joked about your daughter and the problem of getting a job, but as bad as the economy has been in recent years, the proportion of younger adults who live alone has gone down really modestly, from 12% of all young adults under the age of 30 to 11%. And in fact, between 2007 and today, the number of people living alone, the proportion of people living alone has gone up quite dramatically. So the recession has not changed this. I see we're being waved.
Yes, we're being waved. I do want to just sort of end, one of the things you kind of end with in your book is this idea that we should be spending a lot less time trying to shove people into sort of a domestic unit, right? And for me, that really resonated because I come from the housing point of view, and I'm trying to reshape the housing market if possible. And that instead we should be looking at
single people kind of for who they are and look at our society as who we really are and what those needs really are. So, what do you think, like, what's the takeaway, like, if we're going to deputize everybody to be, you know, ambassadors for going solo?
Yeah. Well, you're really better at policy than I am, so I'm reluctant to answer that question. But what I will say is, I don't think we should think about this in terms of who we are, like we are as any particular individuals. I think the thing about living alone that I really came to recognize is that it could be all of us or any of us at some point. So, you know, given what happens in life, I think if you're sitting in this room, whether you are single or married right now, there's no guarantee for how you will be living, you know, 3 years from now, or 5 years, or 10 years, or 25 years, or 50 years from now. I think it's just become impossible for any of us to really understand how it is that our life will turn out. And for me, the reason it's so important to start redesigning cities and to retrofit them for a population that turned out to be this way is we'd like to live in a society that is able to accommodate our needs, which are both needs for privacy and also needs for social connection, regardless of what happens to us. And so it's not about, you know, preferring one group or another or preferring one mode of life over another. It's about recognizing that a lot of people are likely to wind up living alone at some point. The numbers are actually pretty staggering. And we clearly have, by refusing to recognize that fact, which has been true for some time now, we have prevented ourselves from designing intelligently. And since this is a moment, you know, Apple, Steve Jobs, you know, and the rest of it, that's all about intelligent design. There's another concept for intelligent design, but we won't go there tonight. I think we need to do this. I mean, it's really time for us to think more intelligently about how to build and rebuild our cities. And we believe that for climate change now after Sandy, and obviously that's an issue that's dear to me, but we also should believe that just based on the population change.